Hello, this is Douglas Rumbaugh, and welcome to the second video in my Introduction to Programming in Python series. So in this video, I want to talk about getting input into our programs. Now in the last video, I very quickly introduced Python and the way in which we are going to get output from our programs, namely the print function right here. So this is the Hello World program, or a copy of it anyway, that we used last time. And what I would like to do now is take this Hello World program and modify it so that it is a little bit more dynamic. So right now, what's going to happen is if I run my program, it will display the text Hello World. And no matter how many times I run it, it displays the same text, Hello World, over and over and over again. And that's because we are simply printing static text. If I want to write a program that behaves a little bit more like echo, and just as an example, echo is a program and you can access it in most shells. If I echo, say hello, it says hello. Echo goodbye, it says goodbye. So I want to write a Python program that behaves in this way, where I can give it some text and it will repeat that text back to me. It's not a super useful thing, but the basic concepts that go into writing it will enable us to write much more powerful and useful programs in the not too distant future. So right now I have pre-written this program. I'm going to call it echo.py. And I'll just show you how this works. So if I echo hello, then we see hello. It basically is going to work just like the echo command does. So a bit of terminology here. We of course have our Python interpreter that we are calling. And if we want to run a program, we specify the name of the program. Now we can also provide command line arguments. And this is a way of getting input data into the program. So those will follow it and are separated by spaces. So in this particular call, hello is the first command line argument. Goodbye is the second. And hello again is going to be the third. So first argument, second argument, third argument, they are separated by spaces. So what this means is that if I wanted to say hello, goodbye with a space in between, I can't do it this way. It's just going to give me hello. Because of the way that this is set up, as we'll see whenever I start implementing this over in Python. I can, however, put this in quotes to have it be treated as one thing. So if you need to put a space inside of an argument, you have to put it in quotes. This is the same for Python as it is for literally any other program on the shell. So write ls accepts no arguments, or I can give it the name of a directory as an input argument. Same idea. So this should all be fairly familiar. Now, we have to figure out how we're going to actually access these arguments inside of our Python program. So I'm going to clean this up a bit and get rid of some of these comments. They're not particularly necessary. And we'll just look at our print hello world here. So if I want to get input arguments, I'm going to have to do something called importing. Specifically, I need to import the system module. So what is importing and what is a module? Well, in the last video, we briefly discussed this idea of a function. And a function is some code that you or someone else wrote somewhere else, and you're using inside of your program to make life easier on yourself, right? No need to reinvent the wheel. Well, there are a number of functions, such as print, which are baked right into Python itself, and we can just use them. In fact, you'll notice that my text editor has syntax highlighted the word print. It will not syntax highlight every single function call, but print is special because it's a built-in. Now, there are a number of functions, and it's more than just functions. We're actually not going to be using a function here, but something related. But there are a lot of functions that are useful, but aren't useful enough to be baked directly into Python. And so for these, what is done is they are packaged up as something called a library or a module, and then you can import that library or module in order to give yourself access to these functions. So here what I'm doing is I have a module called sys, the system module, which is included standard with Python. No need to do anything special to get it installed. You should have it already. And I'm importing it, which is going to make available to me all of the stuff inside of the sys module. Now, of the stuff inside of the sys module, the thing that I am most interested in is something called argv. Now, argv is short for argument vector, and it is what is going to contain these arguments that I pass into the program. So we're going to want to use that. Before we get to that, though, I do need to address one specific point regarding the way in which Python executes. So now, as opposed to our first example where we had one line of code, we now have two. We have this import sys line, and we have our print hello world line. Now in Python, one of these independent lines of code is often called a statement, and a Python program is a sequence of statements. So how do these two statements execute relative to one another? What order do they execute in? Python is going to always begin with the first statement in the file, and it will execute them one after another in order. So before we get to using arguments, let me just add a few more print statements here so I can demonstrate the order in which things happen. And this should be relatively intuitive. Things are going to happen in the order that they're written, but I just want to illustrate it anyway for completeness. So if I print hello world, followed by goodbye, followed by test, and I run this, we should see the text displayed in the order hello world, goodbye, test. There we go. So as you can see, these lines are executed in the order that they are written. Were I to go ahead and move one of these lines, say hello world to the end, and try this again, we should now see hello world show up at the end. So these lines are executed one at a time in the order that they are written, and that's called sequential code execution. In a few videos, we'll see ways in which we can modify this to execute code in different orders depending upon different circumstances, which will allow us to do things like loop, execute a certain line of code or lines of code repeatedly, or branch, so put if statements, conditions, do this if one condition is met, otherwise do that. And those control structures, is what they're called, will allow us to tweak this default sequential mode of execution. For the moment, though, everything is going to be sequential. So if I remove these excess print statements, what that means is we have currently two lines, and they will be executed in this order. We will first import the system module, and we will then print hello world. So if I just run this program as is, we'll just see hello world. This import statement, in this case, gives you no output. So as far as we, the user, are concerned, looking over here when we run the program, we don't really see any change when we run this import. Okay, now if we want to print something other than hello world, we have to replace hello world with that which we would like to print, and we would like to print the first argument to our program. And so to do this, we will need to access the argv, and let's just print this. So right now, we know the thing is called argv because I told you that, but it's not going to work. We're going to get an error, specifically an error saying that argv is not defined. Now in the next video, we'll talk in more detail about what it means for something to be not defined, but the long and short of it is we don't actually reference the name argv anywhere before we try to print it. And so Python has no idea what the hell we're talking about. Now argv is contained inside of this module. So what we have to do is we can't just drop the name argv in our program. We have to specify what module it's coming out of. So in order to do that, we're going to do sys sys.argv, just like this. So sys is the name of the source module of the thing that we are trying to access. argv is the thing that we are trying to access. And this dot in the middle indicates that the second thing is inside of the first thing. So we are trying to access something called argv that is inside of, that's the dot, the sys module. And where did the sys module come from? Right here. So assuming that argv, it does indeed exist inside of sys, all of our names are defined now. So if I run this, well, actually, first of all, before I run it, I do want to make another point, which is you'll notice that I have just dropped those quotation marks. There are no more quotes here. So why is that? Well, the quotation marks tells Python to treat whatever is inside of them as text, not as Python code. So here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to access a name, some data referenced by a name that's inside of our module. This is code that should actually be evaluated. If we put it in quotes, it's not going to be evaluated. As a matter of fact, let me demonstrate that by putting this in quotation marks right now. So we can put sys.argv in quotation marks, and now when we run it, what we would expect to see is the text sys.argv, not remotely what we want. One thing that I've seen a lot of people do is something along these lines, where when you're writing a code, and say I'm referencing argv, which, as we saw earlier, is going to give a name error, right? The program dies because it's not defined. What I have seen a lot of people do is say, okay, well, I can just put this in quotes, like that, and now I can run it. And strictly speaking, that does resolve the error, right? The program now runs. But I can almost guarantee you that what you were trying to do was not print the letters argv onto the console. You were trying to access some variable somewhere. You were trying to access some specific data. So putting it in quotes like this will make it run, but it's probably not going to do what you want it to do. We'll talk a lot more about this later, but just be aware that if you're getting a name error in a print statement like this, your first instinct might be just to wrap quotes around it, but that's not actually going to fix your problem. And if you do that on, you say, your school homework, it's not going to end very well for you. The problem is usually a little bit deeper than that. So what we really want is to reference sys.argv. And so now let's run this. Let's just say goodbye. And you can see what gets printed out here looks a little bit odd. So this is what's called a list. This is a more complicated data structure in Python. We will talk about it at length later. The general gist of it is that a list is a bunch of things in order. So a list has a first element and a second element, and so on down the lines. These square brackets indicate that we're working with a list. The comma is used to separate elements in the list. Now, what we would really like to have printed out here is not this string representation of the list. We just want to see goodbye. So rather than just printing the entire argument vector, we're going to want to specify what thing we want. So when we're working with a Python collection, a list is a specific case of something called a collection, which is a structure that contains several things under the same name. You can generally access specific elements by accessing them by index, which means what we're going to do is put square brackets just like that after the name, and then put the element number that you want inside of the square brackets. So we have a list here. So we have element 1, the first element, and element 2, the second element, right? So it would stand to reason, and incidentally, the first thing in the argument vector is always going to be the name of the program, and then the next things are the arguments in order. So just to clarify, if I were to call this thing with a whole bunch of arguments like that, you'll see we have the program name is still first, and then the rest of them show up in the order that they were passed into the program. So anyway, going back to this, your first instinct is likely going to say goodbye is the second element. So let's put a 2 in there. And we can test this out and see if it works. and of course it does not, we get this error which says that the list index is out of range, which basically means that this number is not a valid element inside of the list. So what gives? We have two things in the list. We're accessing the second element. Well, in Python and most programming languages, lists don't start counting from 1. They actually start from 0. There are exceptions. R and MATLAB, for example, do start at 1, but most programming languages start at 0, which means that hello.py is going to be element 0, and goodbye will be element 1. It's one thing you have to be careful of. So if I replace this 2 with a 1 and save it, we should now see the word goodbye, just like we want it. So that is something that you will want to bear in mind, is that the list indexes start at 0 and not at 1. We're going to be talking about lists a lot later. They are a fairly wide and deep subject. For the moment, though, we're just going to be working with this specific list, sys.argv, in a lot of programs. Now, what's convenient about the fact that hello.py, the name of the program, is the first thing in the list, that is the thing at index 0, is that 90% of the time we don't care about that. And so we can actually not even really worry about the base 0 thing, because the first argument will be referenced by number 1, the second argument with number 2, and so on. So if I wanted to write a program that would print out 2 things rather than just 1, I can do this, right? Just copy the line and print out the second argument as well as the first argument. So now if I run it with, say, goodbye hello, you'll see it prints goodbye first and hello second. So goodbye was the first argument, so we printed it there. Hello was the second argument, so we printed it afterwards. If I reverse the order so that hello is now the first and goodbye is now the second, we should see hello, goodbye. And we do. So the order here is specific. The first thing you type after the name of the program will always be sys.argv1. The second thing will be 2, third thing will be 3, and so on. And I should also point out that there's no magic in the order in which you write these numbers 1 and 2. By which I mean right now I'm accessing the first argument and then the second argument. I could just as easily do this and access the second argument first. You can access them in whatever order you want. Just be aware, of course, that the order of the lines of code is going to dictate which one gets displayed first. So here, because 2 comes before 1, the way that I have it written, I'll see 2, the second argument, first. So I should see goodbye and hello in that order again. And we do. Okay, so that is how we're going to handle getting input into our programs for the moment. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to data than just text that we can echo back and forth. So in the next video, we're going to spend a fair amount of time discussing different ways in which data is represented, how Python handles data. We'll talk about things called variables, which allow us to give data names so that we can access it later, and a variety of other things along those lines. That will then allow us to take this basic input and output that we have, input via sys.argv and output via print, and write some actually useful programs. For example, a calculator, things of that nature. So that's where we're going to go next. I appreciate you watching this video, and I hope that you found it useful, and I'll see you in the next one when we start talking a little bit more about data.